she's put us in positions, encouraged us to do things for him. Our children sing happy birthday to him. I trusted these people with my own life, my children's life, my students' life. I would have never in a million years thought that this is where we would be. Never. I said to him, Don, this is really bad. We can't have a registered sex offender working around our children. This is very dangerous. And
Pawleys Island Community Church leaders are being held accountable. This comes after a registered sex offender, Warren Perry, volunteered on the campus and was arrested.
On July 13th, 2026, a concerned parent made a phone call that would unravel a South Carolina church. The parent had learned that Warren Spence Perry, a convicted sex offender, was working as a custodian at Pawleys Island Christian Academy, a school serving children as young as 6 weeks old. The next day, Perry was arrested for allegedly violating the conditions of his probation. But that was only the beginning. Within days, the investigation moved beyond Perry. Former pastor Don Williams, his wife Ginny Williams, and Academy Director Jennifer Nikki Howard were arrested and accused of obstruction, conspiracy, and putting children at risk. Then, investigators revealed something that made the case even more explosive. During a conversation with investigators, Don Williams allegedly said Perry had not been around children. Authorities then presented photographs they said showed Perry around children, including at a church event. The sheriff's office said there was additional evidence showing Perry had been around students. And suddenly, this was no longer simply a story about a convicted offender violating probation. It became a question about what church leaders knew, what they allowed, and whether the safeguards they claimed were in place actually existed. A church, a Christian school, hundreds of children. And according to a lawsuit, Perry had volunteered there for approximately 6 years, 3 of those years after his conviction. So how did this happen inside an institution whose stated mission included providing a safe environment for children? To understand how Pawleys Island reached this point, you have to understand what Pawleys Island Community Church had become. This was not a small congregation operating out of a rented room. The church had developed a substantial ministry presence in the community, including Pawleys Island Christian Academy, a church ministry that had served local families for roughly 25 years. The academy eventually served about 300 children, including infants and young children. And at the center of that institution was Don Williams. Williams had served as pastor of Pawleys Island Community Church for decades. Historical South Carolina Baptist Convention records list him as the pastor of the church, and contemporary reporting described his tenure as lasting approximately 27 years. His wife, Ginny Williams, was also deeply involved in the ministry. Historical reporting on the academy described how the school began with a vision involving the Williams family, with Ginny serving as its first principal. That history matters because the church and school weren't two separate worlds. They shared a campus, they shared leadership, and they shared a mission built around families and children. The church itself described Pawleys Island Christian Academy as a place where families had trusted the ministry for 25 years to provide a safe and nurturing environment for their children.
I trusted these people with my own life, my children's life, my students' life. I would have never in a million years thought that this is where we would be. Never.
No, the teachers did not know.
That promise would become painfully important, because years later, prosecutors and investigators would begin asking whether the systems protecting those children had actually worked. And at the center of that question was a man named Warren Perry, because Perry didn't suddenly appear in Pawleys Island in 2026. According to investigators, his connection to the church began years earlier, and the circumstances surrounding his arrival would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. The first major crack in the story appeared when Warren Perry's criminal history collided with the church's decision to let him serve on its campus. Perry had begun attending Pawleys Island Community Church in 2020. That same year, he committed the offense for which he would later be convicted. In November 2023, he pleaded guilty to sexual exploitation of a minor and received a sentence of 10 years, suspended to 5 years of probation. One of the conditions was that he could not have contact with minors. Yet, according to later reporting and court-related documents, Perry continued performing volunteer work for the church. The issue wasn't simply that he was inside a church building. The church also operated Pawleys Island Christian Academy, including an elementary school, preschool, and nursery, serving roughly 300 children. Investigators later said Perry had been working around that campus. And then came the question of who knew. Former pastor Don Williams publicly acknowledged that he and other church leaders knew about Perry's conviction. Williams said leadership made it
difficult to determine where that circle should end. Do we tell every teacher? Do we tell every school volunteer? Do we tell all the parents? Do we tell
You are responsible for that.
Nigga told me that nothing like this had never happened. And this building right now,
made a judgment about how widely that information should be shared and believed Perry was complying with his probation conditions. That explanation became crucial, because if leadership knew, the question was no longer simply whether Perry had deceived the church. It was whether the institution had made a deliberate decision to manage the information internally, and whether that decision adequately protected the children attending the same campus. Then, in July 2026, a concerned parent contacted the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office. What investigators discovered next would transform those unanswered questions into criminal charges. Because according to investigators, the problem wasn't just that Perry had been present. They say there was evidence showing how close he had actually been to children, and that evidence would directly challenge the story church leadership had been telling. Once the sheriff's office became involved, the story began moving from suspicion to evidence. Investigators were no longer asking only whether Warren Perry had been on the church campus. They were examining how he got there, who knew about his restrictions, and whether church leadership took steps to conceal his contact with children. According to arrest warrants obtained by WMBF, investigators allege that Perry and church leaders withheld information about his sex offender status and his presence at Pawleys Island Christian Academy. The warrants further allege that Perry concealed his contact with minors while performing his regular work at the academy. And the evidence investigators publicly presented was striking. During a July 20 press conference, Sheriff Carter showed photographs that he said placed Perry around children. One appeared to show Perry participating in a religious foot-washing ceremony while children were nearby. Another appeared to show him at a church water day event with children present. The children's faces were obscured in the released images. But investigators didn't stop with photographs. The sheriff's office said it was examining forensic digital evidence extracted from devices used by church leaders. Multiple agencies, including SLED, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, DSS, the Attorney General's Office, and probation authorities became involved. Then came another critical question. Were children actually harmed? Authorities have been careful here. Specialized forensic interviews were conducted with students who may have been affected, but the sheriff's office said those interviews had not resulted in criminal sexual conduct to date. That distinction matters. The criminal investigation was increasingly focused on institutional conduct, what leaders knew, what they concealed, and whether children were knowingly placed at risk. And then investigators widened the circle, because suddenly this wasn't just about the pastor, the school director, or Warren Perry. Another church official, one whose job specifically involved campus security and safety, was about to become the fifth person arrested in the investigation. The fifth arrest changed the scale of the investigation. On July 29th, Sheriff Carter Weaver announced that Michael Anthony Fields, Pawleys Island Community Church's Director of Operations and Missions, had been arrested and charged with unlawfully placing a child at risk or causing harm to a child. According to investigators, Fields was responsible for security across the church campus and the safety of students at Pawleys Island Christian Academy. That detail matters, because by this point, the investigation was no longer limited to the pastor or the academy director. It had reached the person whose responsibilities specifically included campus security and student safety. Fields posted a $25,000 bond the following day. His attorney had not been publicly identified in the reporting at that time, and a neighbor defended him, saying he was a good person and describing the arrest as government overreach. Those are important perspectives because an arrest is an accusation, not a conviction. Meanwhile, Warren Perry's own probation hearing produced another significant development. Authorities said Perry was found to have violated his probation, and his case was bound over to General Sessions Court. Investigators said his probation restrictions included no direct contact with minors and restrictions involving locations frequented by children. And the investigation was still expanding. Multiple agencies were examining digital evidence, interviewing witnesses, and conducting specialized interviews with students, but authorities continued emphasizing that those interviews had not produced findings of criminal sexual conduct to date. Then came the consequence nobody could ignore. A church ministry that had served families for approximately 25 years was now facing a crisis so severe that its future and the future of the school operating on its campus was suddenly in question. The collapse became impossible to contain. On August 10th, Pawleys Island Community Church announced that Pawleys Island Christian Academy would formally close after 25 years. Church leadership cited the ongoing investigation, recent events, and licensing issues when announcing the decision. South Carolina Department of Social Services, however, disputed the church's characterization of the licensing issue, saying the facility's decision to surrender its license rested with the facility and its operator. But Pawleys Island Community Church itself has not closed. Services resumed in August, and now church leadership is attempting to rebuild its children's ministry. On August 21st, the church announced that it was partnering with Ministry Safe to review and strengthen its child protection policies and procedures. Church leaders said background checks and training had always been required for children's ministry volunteers, but that they were now even more committed to creating a secure environment for children. That creates a remarkable contrast. The school is gone. 5 people have been arrested. Multiple lawsuits have been filed, and the church is now asking families to trust its leadership again. But trust cannot simply be announced back into existence. It has to be earned. And that is especially true when the allegations involve the very systems that were supposed to protect children. Because ultimately, this story will not be decided by a church statement, a new safety program, or even the headlines. It will be decided by the evidence and by what investigators, prosecutors, and the courts determine actually happened behind the doors of Pawleys Island Community Church. The Pawleys Island investigation does not end with a simple answer. It ends with questions that will have to be answered by investigators, prosecutors, and the courts. What we know is this. Warren Spence Perry, a convicted sex offender, was allowed to perform maintenance and custodial work at Pawleys Island Community Church and its affiliated academy. Former pastor Don Williams later acknowledged that a small group of church leaders knew about Perry's criminal history. Investigators alleged that his presence around children was concealed, and 5 people were eventually arrested in connection with the investigation. But there is another fact that deserves equal emphasis. As of now, authorities have not announced findings of criminal sexual conduct involving the children interviewed during the investigation. The sheriff's office says specialized forensic interviews have been conducted, but those interviews have not produced findings of criminal sexual conduct to date. That distinction matters, because accountability doesn't require us to exaggerate what happened. The documented failure alleged in this case is already serious enough. Questions about disclosure, supervision, probation restrictions, child safety procedures, and decisions made by people entrusted with protecting children. The academy has now closed after 25 years. The church remains open. Lawsuits are multiplying, and investigators are still examining digital evidence, records, and witness accounts. The lesson is bigger than Pawleys Island. Forgiveness is not the same thing as access. A second chance is not the same thing as unrestricted proximity to children. And institutional trust cannot depend on the assumption that everyone will simply believe leadership made the right decision. It depends on transparency, safeguards, accountability, and the willingness to put children's safety above the reputation of the institution. The courts will ultimately determine which allegations can be proven, but one thing has already changed forever. A church that once presented itself as a safe place for families is now being forced to answer the question every institution entrusted with children should be prepared to answer. Who is protecting them? And who is watching the people responsible for protecting them? That is the question at the heart of Pawleys Island. And until the investigation and lawsuits are resolved, the final verdict has not yet been written.